Check, 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 check. There we go. Hey, on the live stream, give me a thumbs up that you can hear me. It should be going over the interwebs now. Okay, good. We are live. Okay, let me, before I start getting off on a, questions. People have questions.
Yeah. So one of the questions I have, like when you're playing the game or making the game, is there a way to lock the mouse to that one screen? So, because I have two monitors, and when I'm moving the mouse, like it ends up on the other monitor. So like when you're like playing the game like live, like when you actually start up the game.
You mean the build of the game?
Yeah. Because when I was playing my game, like test playing it before I put on the zip drive, like my mouse would end up on my other monitor, and like if you make clickable objects, it makes it very difficult to stay there. Because the way that the camera system would like roll around.
Yeah. And if the mouse goes over to the other monitor, it stops manipulating the camera?
No, it doesn't. It moves the camera, but like the mouse pointer would be on the other screen.
So you can't click a clickable object.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
you have to like move the mouse, and then that kind of moves the camera.
Huh. I'll have to look that one up. I mean, I've done, like I have a bunch of monitors, but I never remember specifically thinking about that one.
Well, that was going to be another question I have too. Is there a way to lock the camera just to the player, so like when the player moves, the camera follows it and just stays like right there instead of like having to use the mouse?
Yeah, yeah. So there's different Cinemachine cameras.
Mm-hmm.
So we can look at that in a minute here.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, like that. The second thing that's totally answerable. The first thing, as far as like constraining the mouse, and you're talking about in the build,
Yeah,
right? Not when you're in the editor.
Double click the exe and it loads up.
Yeah, yeah.
On mine, like my mouse will go to the other monitor.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Let me look. That would be, I mean, you can address a bunch of things there. You can make the mouse.
Yeah, because like that's why the first time I played Gavin's game, like I didn't know you could click on the remote because my mouse pointer was nowhere near anything.
Uh-huh.
I was jumping on it and nothing was happening, so I was just like, okay. But the second time, like I actually had to move my mouse where I could see it, because then it would like show the icon.
Yeah, I'll have to look with that second one.
Okay.
Put that as a note on Discord and at me so I can remember to look at that. But yeah, like you can in the startup function, there's a bunch of stuff you can do. Like when I do my other art stuff, I usually turn the mouse pointer off because I don't want it on the screen, but it's still there, and you can visualize it a couple other ways or project it into the game space. But in terms of like just keeping it on, or some, because if you project it into the game space, then even if the pointer goes off the window, you would still see it there. So that might be a solution. There's a solution there,
Yeah.
but let me think about what would be the most elegant way to do it. So you want, like, what do we want to be able to do here? Like, because even if the mouse is on the other screen, it still influences the camera, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but then you couldn't click on a thing,
'Cause you have to
right?
you have to find the pointer again.
Find the mouse, yeah. I mean,
Have you ever played a game where you like it constrains your mouse to just one screen, like you move it all the way to one side and the mouse just like hits the wall and doesn't move past it?
yeah, yeah.
A few games where you can do that.
Yeah.
I don't know like what settings they did. Or how
Yeah, yeah. There's a bunch of settings for the mouse that you can dump into like a startup function there, but yeah, because that's a little bit of Unity, a little bit of Windows there in terms of like while this is running, the mouse can't go to other screens when Windows is clearly interested in letting your mouse go to all screens at all times, right? So
Yeah, like when you play Diablo 4, you could move over like to do something else, but when you play Path of Exile, like you can't move your mouse. You have to actually like alt tab to get out of the game.
and then it goes over there. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure someone's run up against that. I just personally haven't. I'll have to look and see what the deal is there. But yeah, there's probably some solution to that.
I'll tag you that we can look at it.
Okay. Okay, that's a good one. But yeah, the second thing we can look at the other Cinemachine cameras, and I'm going to link to. Fortunately, Unity just redid a bunch of Cinemachine documentation, which is super useful.
Yeah, over the weekend I got an update, so I had a little red icon by the 2 games we made. That said like some things may not work. There's like a hub update. So like everything still works, but there's like a little red icon like when you're at the Unity home screen.
Uh huh.
It says like, this was made with like a later version, some things may not work correctly. So I was like, okay, whatever. So just messing around this over the weekend.
Yeah. I mean, most of the stuff that's getting updated is not. Most of the time, it's not, like the mission critical core stuff that we're doing. It's like the new features that a lot of stuff that we're not actually engaged with at this point. But yeah. So while you're working on the project, like if you started it with 6 or 6.1 or 6.2, whatever, unless there's a reason to update while you're working on the project, I would say don't update the editor as a general rule. Just because they released a new incremental 6.01.34 C, whatever it is, like 90% of the time, it's not going to, there's only downside, right? Like that sort of incremental upgrade is all bug fixing and that kind of stuff. And unless you specifically run up against that bug, in which case you would know. It's not like 6.012 has a bunch of cool stuff that 6.01 doesn't, right? The new cool stuff comes out in 6.1, 6.2, 6.3. That's generally how that goes. And yeah, they are doing it, I mean, constantly. In fact, if most of the time you're installing the new versions of the editor from Unity Hub, but if for some reason you need to be way more granular about it, if you just Google like Unity editor downloads, there's an archive here of all of the micro incremental released versions of it. So yeah. And so if for some reason you were using some package that needed to go to a specific version that wasn't just, if they're being this specific about it, you can get it here. And then in Unity Hub, downloading it here is kind of like outside of this system. And so under installs, locate, you would then have to go to the program files, which in this computer is obscured. So I needed to type C and then get to them. And then program files. And then, yeah, it would appear here. And then you would just say, yeah, there it is. Because you didn't download it through Unity Hub, it wouldn't be, it wouldn't know about it, right? So similar to what you do if you bring in a whole project that you didn't start with Unity Hub. You need to show it where it is on the computer, and then it'll populate in this series of stuff over here, this update of stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Other questions?
We'll wait till after going to the class, because there's stuff on the 185 too.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Because I don't know what we'll be learning the next couple of weeks. Is there a general restriction on what you want our character to be? Because it could impact the animation and stuff if we have like a more rigid object versus like a living character.
Versus a what character?
Like a living, like a person or a cat or something.
Okay, yeah, let's come up with some guidelines. We're going to talk about, because we've done a little bit of modeling here in this class. Some of you have already taken 185 or perhaps 285, and everyone comes in with different amounts of experience. So the overarching rule here is that at the beginning of the semester, I try to be way more specific in terms of do this, this, and this, and this to try and create some sort of base of skills that I know everyone in the class has. The downside to the academic freedom you all enjoy of scheduling classes as you need to finish your degrees has the drawback of the idea of prerequisites is essentially over at this point with school because of people trying to graduate, right? And so, because especially with this program, a program of this size, whether you're in the video game program or the digital media arts program, they're both, as far as GCC is considered, small beans, right? Because we're talking at most hundreds of students, like less than 200 for the most part. Certainly active people, as opposed to nursing, which is like, I don't know, 1,500, like a lot, right? So there's, you know everybody who teaches in this program. It's not like there's a bunch of other teachers, right? So we've got this limited resources to offer the classes. We can't offer every class every semester. In fact, we can't even get close to that, right? And there's this balance between the institution needs to have so many people in the class or else they won't run it. But you guys need the classes to graduate. That is the behind the curtain story of academia there, right? Especially at a community college, right? Is that most of my job when you guys don't see me is me explaining this to people in meeting after meeting after meeting. The institutional conflict, the conflicting institutional interests of graduating students and also making sure classes are full. And because of the size of our program, those two things tend to be at odds because a lot of the classes, if we were to offer them every semester, it would dilute the amount of people per class to the point that the institution would cancel the class, thereby making it tough for the institution to graduate students, right? So, like, this is an ongoing problem. So the idea of prerequisites, that you would take things in a very specific order, which, is obviously the best case scenario, right? If I had, in a perfect world, which doesn't exist, has never existed, and will never exist, I would have everybody take 185, which is 3D modeling, before they took this class, which is 200, right? And the numbers also, at one point, communicated some sort of sequencing there, but that's also kind of at the wayside at this point. And so everyone just tries to take whatever they can in order to try to graduate quickly. And, I'm more sympathetic to your needs than the glacial pace of institutional change. So there's that. And in terms of like what, I'm going to make some character recommendations here, but some of you have more skills, have already taken a bunch of other classes, and in no instance should you not leverage all of your skills in every possible situation, right? So the only downside there is that if you go way off book, there's only one of me and there's a bunch of you, and so at some point my ability to support things that are like way outside of the scope of what we're doing is compromised, right? So that's the overarching frame of this discussion and what we're doing in this project, because I've sort of made a decision here as an educator to make this one looser so that people had more room to stretch, as opposed to the more specifically rigid thing. I did that because I want people to identify more with your work. Like this is a thing I designed. Okay, so there's that. So in general, everybody's skills are different, but using the 80-20 rule in terms of whatever it is you're doing is served us well as a framework, where whatever your particular skill set is, if you're working well within, if you go in knowing that you know how to do 80% of what it is you're planning to do, and we need some clarity on the other 20%, that's generally achievable for me and this number of people. And when you deviate from that, then it tends to get, people get hung up, right, in terms of what's going on. We're going to look at some specific 3D modeling approaches to character-like shapes today, and particularly those will be, techniques and ideas that relate specifically to that modeling problem. In 185, we drill down and talk about the fundamental atomic building blocks of 3D modeling and all those types of things, and we're not going to do that. So it seems like on some level I'm glossing over some things, and I am, in order to try and be focusing on the pertinent skills here, right, in terms of like what level are we operating at. And so leverage all of your skills at all times. This, in general, if I had advice for students, this is the thing, this would be the thing, is that, I've talked about this previously in terms of when we started putting type on the screen. Like, we technically went over putting the type on the screen, but the decisions about the design of said type need to leverage all of your skills from graphic design, right? And so all of the classes for all of the art making are always cumulative, right? You should be drawing on not only your art making skill set, that then ultimately, it's my opinion that, great artists draw on their life experience as well and bring that into what's going on there. That's when it's going to be what makes what you have to say unique and interesting, right? The thing, this was in a talk I went to recently, which I found really rejuvenating, especially in terms of what's going on now with not only the massive amounts of media that are produced just by regular means at this point, right? The just sort of avalanche of things on social media and regular media, right? What makes things distinguishing? How is your personal voice in what you're making, right? Versus making Super Mario 9 or whatever it is at this point, right? So this is a big level question, but how are you building your experience into this, right? And so specifically, tactically here, and I said this before, don't use existing IP. This class, right, not only is that problematic from a putting it online standpoint, it's also, I think, undercutting your ideas, right? Like, what do you have to say? Yeah.
I agree with that because Nintendo is very protective.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you too. But like, and no, like they're also, that's a common sentiment. People worrying about legal exposure. Again, why do people sue other people? What is the end result of a lawsuit?
Money.
Right. How much money you guys got?
Enough for a cup of coffee?
Right. Like, is it enough that Nintendo would be interested in taking it? Again, this is not legal advice, nor am I a lawyer. So even if you did just straight up make Super Mario 9 and post it online, right? Like the most, you would get some sort of like cease and desist, like, hey, take that down, right? It's only in instances where there has, because it's not, it costs money to sue people, right? Like just that part of it, right? So like there's not something that isn't generally engaged in a completely wanton fashion. And you're all students, so there is, again, I am not a lawyer, but there is an educational use clause in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that I cannot give you some sort of reliable legal interpretation of. Just know that there is a clause about educational use in actual piece of legislation that was passed that I don't anecdotally know of any situation where a student made a project in a class that resulted in some sort of legal calamity. The only one that I can think of recently comes to mind, is not even a game-related one, is the guy at Columbia who designed that software so that you could use AI on, what are they called? LEET exams, LEET tests, LEET, the coding exams for getting hired at Google. It's LEET, right? LEET. Anyways, so that you could sort of use AI in real time on those exams. And that was like a really, again, like that, he did something, brilliant and pointed directly at the most lucrative companies in the world, right? So there's none of what we're doing here even, scrapes the surface of that level of thing, right? Where there was actually legal proceedings, and what he did was so brilliant that even though he got expelled from Columbia, he immediately got, incredible job offers from all of the companies that he was subverting. So, good story. I'll see if I can find the link to that and post it, or some write-up of what's going on there. But that was like last year before that, something like that. anyways, that's the only one I can even think of, besides the situation with Pal World. I mean, if you played Pal World, right? Like this much darker survival take on characters that look very similar to Pokemon. And so again, a Nintendo, they don't own Pokemon, whatever the legal relationship is, they have a vested interest in not having Pokemon, in protecting their Pokemon copyright. So, but again, that became the most popular game on Steam for like a notable amount of time. So like I wouldn't, don't use existing IP in terms of, not because I'm particularly interested in legally protecting you, because I'm not able to do that, nor am I a lawyer, nor is this legal advice. You should do this from an aspirational standpoint to believe in your ideas. Right? If you believe in yourself, you can sidestep the legal system. That's not legal advice, nor am I a lawyer. So there we go. I think I've indemnified myself for this. So there's that. Yes. Did you have a question? No.
I did, but I forgot it, so.
Okay.
Right, I was going to ask if there were any particular lectures from the 185 class that you think would be good supplemental material?
Yeah, I'll link to those. Remember, it's all on my channel. But yeah, I'll link to those, and then like I'm going to give another one of those here in a minute, right? So it's not like I'm not going to give you any guidance on 3D modeling. It's just sort of like I can't also teach 185 within 2 weeks of AVC 200, right? So, and everybody has different experience with their comfort level of comfort in Blender or anything else, right? So don't restrict yourself based on what I'm trying to show everybody if you know more than that. Does that make sense? Okay. This is part of making digital interactive art, is that wouldn't it be great to not have any restrictions on your ideas and you could just creatively manifest your visions unimpeded by technical and or resource-based limitations? Yeah, maybe. First of all, is that achievable? No. And then second, I mean, I think I talked about this before, either in this class or another class, right? You guys familiar with the sophomore slump idea in music? Mm-hmm. That the first record from a band is a hit, it's really good, it breaks out, and then they get famous, they get rich, and the next album is like, not as good, right? Because that's the real situation that happens often. It's because the constraining factors on their creativity for the first record resulted in something that was way more significant, way more interesting. And then once you can do anything, once you can do everything, why would you do anything? Is a ubiquitous question that makes it hard for people with no restrictions to make meaningful art, right? The things that are interesting art-wise in every genre, how many of those are made by hyper-rich people with no constraining factors on their ideas? Not a whole lot, right? So I think that's a notable pattern there. I'm not saying don't try to make money, but don't make too much money. I don't know. That doesn't seem like a problem a lot of people have these days. It's a decreasing amount of people faced with that issue. Like we'll call it the Scrooge McDuck problem, right? Where your pool of money is just too big. How could I possibly swim in this giant pool of money? Like I couldn't even make it the whole way across. Does everyone know what I'm talking about when I say Scrooge McDuck?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. Casey said, thinking about his references, getting increasingly older every semester. Great. Okay. So, sort of big picture stuff there. More tactical ideas here. Things to avoid: loose, billowing, clothing. This is kind of like shop class, right? We don't want to. By also, I might also avoid open-toed shoes. Because that means you have to model toes, perhaps, right? Which would be a time-consuming endeavor. Yeah, so we'll call this our shop class tactic or strategy. In that, something we're certainly not going to cover and requires a bunch of technical hoop jumping to make happen in a real-time environment is real-time cloth simulation. And so there's a reason a lot of certainly older video game characters wore clothes that were like very form-fitting, in that ends up being technically less challenging. A lot of video game characters, maybe not wearing any clothes, right? Like Sonic has shoes on. He's not wearing pants. So make note of that.
No pants.
You're taking the wrong. That's not what I wanted to say. I'm not trying to squash everyone's ideas, but just sort of think about it, because we'll look at some ways to. Not all of the detail needs to be modeled, right? In that, this is the hardest part about making this kind of digital art, is that the final product differences, maybe even slight differences in the final product, require massively different workflows, right? As opposed to drawing, right? Where you end up with a drawing, the workflow for drawing is get paper, get pencil, make marks on paper until you get to drawing, right? Regardless of what you're drawing, that's the workflow for drawing, right? Which is part of its universal appeal, in that there's not a lot of technical divergent paths and dead ends that you could run into along that creative path, right? But here, the whole thing is dead ends and technical roadblocks and all sorts of stuff, right? Especially because just to get to two things that look fairly similar, right? Like just the decision that like, oh, no, I want my character to be outlined. Okay, like that, now we need to back up and think about how that's going to work in terms of the, shader that we're using, or, like one of the ways to create character outlines is to do this reverse hull technique, where you sort of duplicate the mesh and then invert the normals, so that you get this character outline, right? If you're drawing the character, it's like, well, I just outlined the character, and you're done, right? Whereas here, that's like a significant technical side path to take in the creative process there, right? So that's one of the overarching challenges here. If you have experience, you might want to explore, quadrupeds, but no experience, I would stick to bipedal characters, or let's not forget the world of no legs, right? Some important, like R2-D2 kind of rolls around, right? There's various, my son's super into Pokemon now, so now my Pokemon literacy is far exceeds what it previously was. There's tons of Pokemon that float. Pokemon's a good example here. Now that I see like a lot of it, in terms of efficient character design, because they're, you know, in the games certainly, and in the shows, they're kind of, the whole thing is pointed at massive output, right? In terms of like the number of Pokemon, the number of shows, the number of games, the length of said games. Like, it's a big thing. So they're looking at massive amounts of stuff there. And so they're trying to make decisions both in the animation and in the game design that really emphasize scale, right? In terms of like lots of stuff. And so that's important there, right? I mean, my memory for the names of said Pokemon is not great, but you know, there's plenty of them that don't have legs, where they're just kind of like floating, or you know, levitating, or whatever it is that they're doing. You know, there's a sort of the categories of Pokemon. You know, like the visual classifications of Pokemon versus the you know, strategic game-related classifications of Pokemon, right? Your metals and your paranormals and your grass types and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
When you do animation, do you import that into Unity, or are you doing the animation keyframing in Unity?
We're gonna do it in Blender and bring it in. Yeah. So for a character animation, you can animate it in Unity the same way that we've done keyframe animation for the other things. But at that point, in terms of creating it, the Unity editor, it's totally possible, but there's definitely not as many creature comforts as there are in the Blender animation editor. And so in terms of creating the animation or doing some fine tuning, it's definitely easier there and bringing it in. But that comes at the cost of it being less flexible once it gets into Unity, right? The reason I've emphasized doing the keyframe animation in Unity up until this point is because we weren't doing hyper complicated multi-part things. And if you do it in Unity, that's the most flexible workflow because the keyframes are just right there. You can just dive into the editor and move them around and do whatever you need to, as opposed to going back to another program and coming back and forth, right? Every time you go back and forth, every time you include some other program in your workflow, you know, there's some non-zero amount of, you know, time sink that's a result of doing that. And you need to make a decision as you go forward, right? Like, are these going to be the tools that you're using to do this in 5 years? Maybe not, right? In fact, the rate of change in the tools right now is so fast that like almost definitely not. Although I've been saying this for 5 years about After Effects, hoping that like in 5 years I could just stop using After Effects, and that has not panned out yet. And now it's starting to look like a lifelong curse at this point. Like he kept thinking about never using After Effects. I mean, it's way closer than it was ever before. But
You just cursed it for 5 minutes.
this is some sort of like digital art Edgar Allan Poe short story. After Effects being the program I've buried underneath my floorboard in my wood floored house. Yeah, and so if you're not familiar with Pokemon, most of you, it's been my experience that a lot of students, especially people like I'm just a shade too old, right? This happened after I was like, I don't know, 15 or something, and so I was just past it, the very initial wave in America, and so I never, you know, I did any of this stuff. But you know, I know a lot of you have, and so I think there's, in terms of like achievable, interesting varieties of simple-ish character design, there's a lot to be gleaned from here, right? These people have gone through, the Pokemon designers have gone through this process a lot, right? And so they're not designing some sort of hyper complex Pokemon because it wouldn't be visually consistent. And then also, if you make a new Pokemon, you know it's going to have to go in the game, you know it's going to have to go in the show, you know it's right. And so the other, you know, the show animators, the game designers are, you know, not super jazzed about, you know, the new Pokemon that has the complexity of like Optimus Prime does now, right? And learning is, you know, like all that stuff flying around, right? That would not be a really great. It would just require a lot more work than the other things. You got a question? You? Yes.
What about retro Pac-Man, like the ones from the arcades?
Yeah. So we're making things now. All of our ideas engage with the past to some extent in the way that we're postmodern creators that are, you know, influenced by things that happened before. The idea of like making your own take on Pac-Man is that I don't know if I discourage that because I don't think that's a good strategy for your career, right? Not that it's an artistically bankrupt idea. I'm saying that as you're showing people your skills, it's not a good strategy right now to dump a bunch of time into making something that looks like it came out 45 years ago, right? Are there people sort of leveraging that on Steam to some extent? Yes. But I mean, to my eye, the most successful versions of engaging with retro design are people who are like engaging with that, but then also modernizing it in very significant ways, as opposed to making games that look like they came out 45 years ago, because that may not be a great career strategy, right? Like unless you have a time machine, you're going to go get back and get, you know, hired by Atari 35 years ago. I'm not sure what the path forward is there in terms of like just you making good use of your time building your portfolio. Does that make sense? So the better question there, or maybe a more useful thing, would be like, what do you like about the Pac-Man character design? Is there a way that you could use that to, you know, influence something about your character design for this project in a way that allows you to showcase your skills, right? You want your like, this is obvious, but I'll say it. You want your portfolio to be full of strong work that represents your skill set, right? As opposed to dumping a whole bunch of time into making stuff that A, you're not really into, B, isn't the kind of work that you want to do, and C, you know, quote unquote, looks bad, right? This is the other thing I discourage in a lot of other classes where someone's like, well, this intentionally looks bad. Yes, there is art that, you know, is either difficult to process or is visually abstract to the point that it's hard to understand. That art is important. Is that art great to put into a portfolio for people trying to get hired, right? Like if you're just going to separate yourself from the capitalist industry and just go on a path as a solo artist, completely manifesting your own ideas, cool. Some people do that, right? But obviously making that the focus of the class wouldn't be a really great institutional strategy for me as the instructor here and the institution in general. So does it make sense what I'm saying there? Yeah. Okay. So in terms of brainstorming your ideas, we can look at, how you would approach a bunch of these concepts here. And yeah, I think that these are really interesting in that there's a lot of different strategies here in terms of minimizing different types of animation. Like my son was playing Scarlet most recently, and just watching it, like the animation sidestepping, like you never, when the character falls in the water and then you get out of the water, you never see the character get out of the water. It just cuts to like, I'm back on land now, as a way to just sort of sidestep what would be not an insignificant problem of like animating the character getting out of the water, right? Which would be it's not just like one animation. It's like, well, how big is the shore? Is it like there's a lot of, especially when you start looking at this, I mean, you guys have been through the process to some extent once now, right? And you understand that making nonlinear interactive stuff in many instances presents this exploding possibility of things happening, which you need, in some cases, you need to consider as a designer and then accommodate, right? And so, especially as designers with limited resources, being your time and your attention, like you want to try to strategically avoid situations, putting yourself in situations with this like, oh my gosh, like making that decision means I'm going to have to do a bunch of X, Y, or Z, right? If you run up against those situations as we're doing this, because this project is more open-ended, you may want to take a step back and be like, is there some other artistically viable decision to make that would sidestep this issue, right? Because I just don't have the resources to create 30 different getting out of the water animations, right? And then also, even if I did that, how much bang for my buck am I getting there, right? In terms of like, if someone's playing the game, it's not even something that, like I would notice, where it's just sort of like, oh yeah, they spent the time to make 40 different getting out of the water animations here. Like, did I even get out of the water 40 times? Probably not, right? And so there's that. So think about at every point here, this whole project is pointed at make something that you like, that's going to be a cool thing for your portfolio, right? And so how is it related to your ideas and your identity as an artist and how you're developing that? And then how is it something that you can show to people and be like, look at this cool thing I did here? And so a lot of it, because you guys identify as artists, you should emphasize the visual world building, visual design of it. We're going to try to accommodate as much of the game functionality as possible for everybody, but it's not CIS 151, the game programming class, where the focus is solely on that, right? I think it's way more rewarding for everybody to make actual games that work versus sort of like, there's people who teach this class where they're just like, yeah, design this environment that would go into a game, right? As opposed to making the actual thing. I think the technology has expanded to the point where it's like, no, you can just make the thing at this point to some extent, right? It's not completely unbounded by constraints, but we can get way, way closer. And this has been the class that's had the most change in that over the course of my teaching it, right? I've taught this class for like 8 years. 8 years ago, we did not make like fully functioning video games in this class because it was just sort of, the tools weren't up to speed and it was just too much over the course of one semester. But now, like last semester, everybody made 2 video games, right? You made one in Unity, you made one in Unreal. This semester, we'll kind of make 3 where we did that initial thing, then we'll do this one, then we'll do something in Unreal, right? And so it's part of my motivation for the class to do things that are relevant to the tools as they use now. Okay, so in terms of difficulty here, what is it? S class, and then it's A underneath S, right? Yeah, right. And then B perhaps. But keep in mind that that's in terms of difficulty for the animation, right? In terms of the design and how it fits into your game, think about what the character is going to look like and animate in the game, right? There's plenty of instances where this would be, not only technically less work in terms of like the actual implementation, but perhaps it's a better design decision in terms of like how the character fits in the game, right? If it's like a ghost, right? Well, then floating around makes artistic sense and narrative sense for the game, depending on if it's a floaty old style ghost versus a, jump out and scare you newfangled ghost, right? It depends. Great. So avoiding building clothing, right? We'll use the Incredibles rules here. Don't have open-toed shoes, no capes. Capes are going to be a lot of animating there. Drupheads. There we go. All right. One of the biggest bang for your buck design-wise is having some sort of functional eyes. One of the biggest things that's going to bring the characters to life is just being able to blink. The other stuff in terms of mouth, nose, I'm going to say no teeth. Like that's going to be a whole thing, right? Like you have to ask how many weeks of time do you want to put into this character's teeth, right? Like how much time do you want to put into your own teeth, right? Like think about those things. But eyes are a super important part of the character design. Like you've just, we're sort of tacitly aware of this, right? Everything, everywhere, all at once. Again, providing wonderful guidance here. You take googly eyes and you put it on anything, and you've immediately accomplished 90% of anthropomorphizing that thing, right? Like the rock scenes from Everything Everywhere All at Once. If you haven't watched Everything Everywhere All at Once yet, like put it on your list for this weekend. In terms of like movies released in the last 10 years, probably my favorite. Like just really, it's one of the movies, like it's like a truly cinematic experience, right? We've been talking about it in 240 a lot in terms of really taking advantage of the idea that this is a movie which engages with the entire history of visual storytelling in movies. Okay, we'll come back to this, but I suppose this is a good starting list here for your character design. Let's look at some of the tactical parts of it here. And so this is one, I'll link to this video, but I would write this down. These are old videos, but really good examples of making evergreen content in that these are not tutorials. These are just sort of very, very short explanatory pieces of content about some sort of fundamental computer graphics concepts that I think do a really good job of clearly explaining those things. And so here, if we look at this, I think this is a really good visual demonstration of the idea of blocking out something that's more complex, like a character, right? We made a trash can, right? And so the trash can, we took the cylinder and changed it. But here, right, this is a really great visual representation of blocking out a character, right? So now the character here is a quadruped. My message to you here is not that everyone should make lizards. My message to you here is look at the visual sequencing of events here, right? This is a really good visual representation of the term blocking out a character. Just like in drawing class, which I'm certain your instructor, no matter who they were, told you that any complex shape can be broken down into an array or sequence of simpler shapes, right? And that concept applies in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, right? And then in our case, like 4 dimensions, with the 4th dimension being time, once things start to animate. And so I've always appreciated this sequence here. Let me do this like this, in that it clearly shows how something can be constructed from primitive shapes here. Then the primitive shapes can be merged in a variety of ways, and detail can be added, right? Once the shapes are merged together, there's a couple different ways to go about that. But things to take notes about here is that the primitives are being used, and then we see the primitive appear, and then most of the time we see the topology of the primitive change, right? And so, especially with this, after you guys create your game design documents that we'll look at on Wednesday that you'll complete tomorrow, or like we'll say you'll complete the first draft of tomorrow. This week is going to be about getting to our first draft of our main protagonist. And so this is going to give us some room so that we can look at everybody's pitch on Wednesday for your game and start to refine that, right? Do some initial feedback in terms of like, this doesn't sound achievable given our skill, given our constraints, right? The main constraints being your time, our time, and your skills, right? Those are the main constraints here. So we'll do that. But as we refine the overall shape of the game, the first thing we're going to do is make the main character here, right? And we're going to block it out this week. And so we have to work in parallel here, where there'll be one, right? Like this line represents the character modeling. This line represents the initial development of the game design document. Then we start to refine the game design document as we're refining the character design here. And then we start to put the game together and we block out the assets. And as we're doing that, we're continually talking about the functionality of the game and whether that will be covered in the script base, the code base that we have, right? Would it be great to do these things sequentially, one after the other? Maybe. Would that be easier to understand initially, where you do this, then you do this, then you do this? Yes. Does any project I've ever worked on end up working like that? No, never, right? It always ends up being these parallel lines of development, and there'll be unavoidable situations of like, I got here, now I need to go back here and then take a sidestep, and so I can go this way. All right. I try to set this up with some sort of balance between flexibility and not having everyone have to do a ton of this, right? But doing some of that is just part of doing this job. Is this painful? Yes. Do I too bulk at doing this and then sometimes charge ahead regardless of the fact that I should have done that and then have to do a bigger one later? Yes. All right. So be aware, right? So this part of doing this kind of work well is being able to be your own project manager there in terms of understanding, well, we're working on this now. One of the questions, when I wake up in the morning, it's like, what needs to happen next in the multiple threads that are happening on this project, right? This is part of, my metaphor of seeing myself as a, machine computer-ish kind of thing, right? Computers are multi-threaded. And so like you're sending different jobs to different threads, right? And, more of a, is that healthy from a psychological perspective to frame your entire inner workings as some sort of computational, cold, unfeeling computational machine? No. There are probably not. It's a question I'm working on with my therapist, right? Not with you. So, but I think it is useful just from a standpoint here that like this class is about computers. We know how computers work, and being able to identify our project and fit our workflow into the workflow of these machines that we use as our primary tools, which are incredible, but do require some change there. That's all important. So that's where we're kind of going here, okay? Right. So this week's work is going to be about, because regardless of the concept changes, usually at this point you're like, it's a living blob. Actually, making a living blob would not be, maybe a great strategic decision. Like, well, depending on how blobby you would want it to be. And then perhaps the game design can change around that protagonist, right? So as you're working on multiple threads, there is some level of commitment here. Like, well, I've committed to this. That's going to affect this over here, right? And so there is that balancing that happens. But the thing I want you to get out of this is like every complex thing can be broken down into simpler shapes, right? And at this point, we all know how to like make simple shapes in Blender, and we'll talk again about arranging them here and managing their topology to some extent. But if we look at this, I believe this keeps going here, and we'll see these get merged. And I think this is a really good, the other thing to take away here is the duplication, which the computer is really, really good at, and then the mirroring. So we'll definitely follow that 100%, in that I would encourage you, in fact, I'll put that on our list there. I would encourage your character to be symmetrical, right? As opposed to massively asymmetrical, right? Where, how much asymmetry, an asymmetrical character is going to require more attention in terms of the animation and more attention and time in terms of the modeling, right? And so moderately asymmetrical things will probably be okay. Like a Hellboy level of asymmetry where like one hand is slightly bigger than the other hand. I mean, not slightly bigger, it's like kind of giant or whatever. But as opposed to like the character has, like 16 tentacles on this side and then one grabber arm on, like that sounds like probably not achievable for us, right, at this point. So symmetry being good and symmetry being more achievable here in that the mirror modifier does it in one click in Blender, right? In every program. It's like every program has a mirror modifier. And so that's, in this video, it's just a crossfade. It's a considerable amount of time going from this, where everything is individual primitives, which is a good way to block everything out, to getting everything into one coherent mesh. So right there, right? If you're paying attention, you'll notice that the topology of the body changed significantly to accommodate these parts here, okay? Now we're not going to go crazy with we're going to try to focus on the topological efficiencies that will be the most effective for us. What happened to the full screen button? What was that? Okay, whatever. But really great example of visually blocking something out, and then we can see how it comes together into a solid piece of topology. For most of you, the body, even if it has separate clothing areas, is going to end up as one mesh object. And the mesh object is deformed by bones, okay? The notable exception here would be eyes, and eyes are one thing in particular, just like a bunch of the other situations we talked about, where how you want the eyes to look would result in different technical approaches to how to implement that, right? Whether they're going to be a particular piece of mesh, or perhaps something that's done by switching out animating a transition between textures on the face, right? So there could be multiple options there. We'll look at two, I guess. Any questions about this? Does this make sense? The idea that we can take anything, break it down. The process of breaking it down, I would have in my notes as a block out, because we'll use that term again when it comes to the level design, where we'll block out the level design. The video game term for that, when you block out a level design, is called gray boxing, in that, you know, a lot of games are very made up of squarish things, and so they just use cubes to block things out, and then the gray boxes are slowly replaced with assets, right? One of my good friends works for Gearbox, and so, you know, at different points I got to see him play where Borderlands 4 was at different points over the last couple of years. And yeah, I mean, like, same thing there. Like, there's several, I haven't had a chance to, you know, buy and play any. Has anyone played Borderlands 4 yet? The one that just came out like last week, right? Or the week before, or something like that. Anyways, yeah, these massive levels were just a bunch of cubes for a long time. And then here, the smoothness, right? This can be added later, right? Like when you're making your decisions about blocking out, and you're making your decisions about the shape of the object, you should default to less topology, right? As you're blocking out, like, what is the minimum amount of topology you need here to roughly represent this shape? And that's whether it's a slider or whether it's going to be right-clicking and subdividing. Like, do I need to subdivide again? Most of the time, no. You want to be conservative there, because adding more topology to smooth out the surface of something later in the process is easy. Removing or remanaging dense topology, something that got too dense early on, is much more finicky. And a lot of times, my recommendation is going to be go back and just do that part again with less topology, right? Because again, one of the inconvenient truths of doing this, like those retreads we talked about earlier, is that especially for beginners, it's much easier to sort of like do it again simply the second time to try and fix something that went off the roads, right? Look how hard it is, just as we experienced with Unity. I wrote all the Unity scripts that you guys are using, but still we constantly run into situations where someone has thrown it into a state and it's impossible for me to tell because some box is checked somewhere. It's like, so fixing is usually much, much, much more difficult than going back and doing it again cleanly, right? So same thing here. But in terms of topology, trying to commit to less topology here, more topology is going to be smoother. And then there's the whole issue of detail, okay? For instance, the nostrils on this lizard, right? This is like about the level of detail where the question starts to become, is this in the actual mesh, or is this something that's going to be in the texture, in the material, right? Where it's not something that we actually need to model, it's something that can get painted onto the surface later, right? Just this basic decision is a fundamental decision for 3D modeling. The answer to this question is a little bit dependent on what are you going to do with this 3D model, right? Because this is the other part of doing this digital work, is like, what is the end result, right? Is this going to be a Blender movie? Is it going to be in a video game? Is it going to go into a virtual reality headset experience, right? And depending on which of those things you're aimed at, it may result in a different answer to this question. Where does this detail go, right? And that, we know we're all going into a Unity game that needs to be reasonably performant, right? And so I can give everyone some solid guidance there. And in this case, like if this were going to be the main character of somebody's game, this is definitely a level of detail where I'd be like, this is something that should be done in the texture, not in the model. Because in order to represent a detail this small, you need to massively increase the amount of topology there, which means that you have to transitioning between areas of high density and areas of low density is a tough skill to develop. It's a tough thing to manage and requires a lot of skill to do it in a way that works well, especially for models that animate. For models that don't animate, for like your props that are just sitting there, is not as important that be done in a way that is the right way, right? The right way is the right way because it deforms well. If the topology is not correct, it when you go to move the arm, you could get all sorts of artifacts and stuff like that because it's not done the right way. But if it's just a book that's sitting on the desk, it could just be something that's there. In fact, what was it, last semester, did anybody play, what was the space game that Bethesda just released? Starfield, right? Anybody play Starfield? Yeah. Massive open world game. Did you like it? Did you guys like it?
I thought it was really cool.
Yeah.
I got tired of it. I get that though. I get that though, yeah.
What part of it did you get tired of?
I guess I'm just not used to Bethesda games. I don't know. It was like there was a lot, but at the same time there was like nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, you go to a planet and there's like nothing there. You walk around the planet surface for an hour, you're like, what is everything?
No, yeah, exactly. And I just remembered something. I remember I was like on one of the planet. I think I was on the city planet, and I decided to leave the city, and I just roamed around, and I walked like for 30 minutes, and I found something. I was like, oh, that's so cool. And then I realized I wasn't at that quest yet, and it was just, I wasn't supposed to be there, so I couldn't do anything. And then I was just like, great, I have to walk back now. And then that's when I quit. That was the end.
Here we go. Here's my point, right? This is a model of a sandwich in Starfield, right? And
We should subdivide that more.
yeah, it's a master class in like what not to do. But it made it into the game here, right? Because I don't think, it's a sentient sandwich in the game, or at least it's not on the sentient sandwich planet in the game. And it just sits there, right? And so the threshold, is it slightly more work for the computer because there's all these faces in it? Yes. This is somewhat sidestepped because of a term I don't know if we probably won't end up doing this for any of the stuff that we need, but LODs, levels of detail. The idea that wouldn't it be great if we saw really, really detailed models when they were close to the camera, and then when they were far away from the camera, the polygons number of faces reduced, so it wouldn't be as much work for the camera? Yes, that would be great. In fact, it's called levels of detail. And LODs is commonly how you see that referred to. And you can either do this yourself in creating multiple versions of it. And now, to some extent, Unity and Unreal have systems that do this automatically to some extent. And so some of that is probably happening with this sandwich, I guess. Anyways, this is like a really unoptimized model that's in, a game that theoretically had what we would describe as near unlimited resources pointed at its creation, right? But nearly unlimited resources of one of the biggest game studios in existence, right? But still, the argument could be made, perhaps by you guys, that they bit off more than they can chew, right? Where the idea is that we're going to recreate the entire galaxy. Geez, that sounds like a big job. I haven't been to the whole galaxy, but it seems like there's a lot of stuff out there, right? And so, did they thoroughly represent that in a way that was interesting, right? There's a larger question to ask about, is the actual galaxy ubiquitously interesting if you go from planet to planet versus the Starfield galaxy, which apparently not, right? You got to a planet and then you didn't like it, right? Or
Like the city.
yeah, the city. Well, yeah, that's the main hub or whatever, right? Yeah, but
Was it called New Atlantis? I think so.
really,
Yeah.
I haven't played in a long time.
that seems like a remarkably lazy name.
Yeah. Well, and that's a remarkably lazy sandwich. Actually, looks like that took more work to model it that badly. How did you even do that?
It looks like you just loop select that edge and then do the fill thing or whatever.
Yeah, like the bread was definitely like an extrusion with then a boggling number of subdivisions on the bevel. And then the bologna, there's some sort of N-gon subdivision mess happening there, right?
Cheese is just a plain.
Yeah. Yeah.
The cheese is the best part.
Yeah. And then, this lettuce if I see lettuce that looks like this on a real world sandwich, I'm not eating it, at all. Is this what it ends up looking like when rendered? Right. And so, if it is, there's some more evidence that you can save yourself in the texturing process after doing that.
You just need enough pebbles.
I think that's there's stuff to be learned from that sandwich. I wouldn't take that away as something about that sandwich that I would emulate, right? This sandwich just isn't beveled enough. What was the other thing here? Mostly symmetrical. Okay. Good. Okay. So on the computers at school, for those of you who use them at any point, I believe you guys can do this too. It's on the ones here. There is, we can't install software, but there is the software center. So if you go and look here, there's a software center, and that's where some of the, as far as I understand, that's the institution's plan for releasing new versions of Blender, in that then they don't have to like reach into all the computers and install it, which requires time and energy and resources. They can just sort of publish it to Software Center, and then you can just opt in or opt out. So I've asked them to put 4 or 5 here. Maybe it happens soon. I don't know. We'll see. Anyways, because a lot of you are using 4 or 5 at home, there's a couple new things in 4 or 5 which were good. But the let's look here and look at some possibilities for what's going on. As you're sketching your character here, let's look at some good and bad. So like these are all character turnarounds. The important part here is having a side view or front view and a side view that are lined up in this way, where this is like an orthographic presentation and the specific important parts of the body are lined up in the side and front. In terms of modeling, having just these two is enough. Maybe a 3/4 view, but most of the time just this and this are fine for getting the modeling process started, okay? The level of detail here can be pretty low. Main thing we're concerned with is proportions, and then like a lot of the detailing here, again, can happen in the texturing and materials part of the process, okay? And so the main things to focus on here are the silhouette of the character, right? The outside shape. What's good here in this particular example is that we have side and front. What's not good here is the pose, okay? And so in terms of bipedal-ish beings, we want the arms to be out to the side. For a lot of 2D animation turnaround type things, you'll see things where the arms are down next to it. This presents problems when we take a step later on and we start to rig the character using some fashion. What we're looking for, rather than having the character's arms down to the side, is what's referred to as the T pose, having the arms out, forming a, everybody gets this, right? Why it's called the T pose here, right? The reason that this is good is that when you go to create weights for the character, it makes it very easy to distinguish the arm section, and so that the bones that are here are less likely, I'm not gonna say not, are less likely to influence the part of the mesh that's on the arm, and vice versa, where the bones that are in the arm are less likely to influence the torso. And so that makes that easier, okay? Now, let's say that you're not doing a bipedal character like this guy, Bellsprout, right? Let's say that this is where you're going, right? You would need to take the principles of the T-pose, which is like individually moving appendages during the modeling phase. You want to be kind of like sticking out, right? Or even if they're gonna eventually be folded in, right? Bellsprout's leaf arms are here most of the time. When you're modeling them, you want them to be out so that then you're able to manipulate them and make that easier to use. It'll make the rigging process simpler, right? Also, right, what you're doing this week is probably just sketching out and the general appearance of whatever it is that you're imagining as the protagonist, right? But later this week, once you sketch it out for modeling purposes, right, this curved shape, even if that's the shape you would want your character to take, probably not having that be the position that it's initially modeled in. You'd want this to be straight, and then you could curve it using the armature later, right? So another word here to keep in mind is that we want to, the armature is certainly the, A? I think it's an A. The bones in the mesh. We're not going to create those this week. We're just going to be creating the mesh. But we need to forecast down the process a little bit so that, again, we can try to avoid a bunch of backstepping. Okay? Let's look here. Right, so especially if your character is going to be chonkier, then you want the stubby appendages definitely further out so that even their limited motion is able to be represented in the in the animation, right? If all the stubby appendages are very close to the body in the modeling phase, it's going to be much more difficult to separate those out later and make them discrete, okay? The big picture here, how do I already have this many tabs open? Okay, let's look at this from sort of the 20,000 feet view. Block, sketch, character inside and front view. Block out character with primitives. We need to make some decisions there about modeled level of detail, right? Depending on how detailed the character is, what gets modeled into the level of detail. A couple guidance things here, like clothing folds. Right? I've specifically said avoid puffy shirts and capes and weird puffy hats, although a hat is easier than a shirt. That clothing folds would be something that goes, all of these things would be in the category of texture detail. In that clothing folds, for us, would be something that we would put into the normal map, not for the most part into the model itself. Buttons would be something, again, that could be represented there in the texture detail. So let's put a little arrow there like this, like so. The freckles, right? Obviously, the kind of thing, spots, all of this would go into the texturing detail. Other ideas. Yeah. So yeah, on a robot, nuts, bolts, rivets, unless they're giant parts of the silhouette, would be things that would go into the texture. I'm thinking because there's like this really prominent nut-based enemy in Astrobot. And in that case, it is something that's in the mesh.
Would a lapel be a texture detail?
Yeah. Yeah. And so like collar, unless it's like a very flamboyant lapel, you know, depending on like, is it sticking out? Like Dracula's Cape is a good one. The only thing I was coming up with was the enemy from Flash Gordon, the movie. Totally useless reference. Yeah, Dracula's Cape, a much better. But in that case, we would want the flamboyant lapel, no cape, right? So something to keep in mind, depending on how vampire-based your ideas are. Yeah, so like there's this Astrobot enemy that like is literally a giant nut, and so yeah, like, that's not a texture detail. Obviously, it's like the mesh itself. But yeah, anything where there would be smaller detail, like along here, I think you can kind of see that. That's all stuff that would be in the texture there. Over here. Okay, so at that point, you're making that kind of decision about those things. Then we would need to let's sidestep this a little bit and get this down to, we'll call this and this is going to simplify the topology. It's going to be a series of joining and to some extent remeshing, and then to some extent there could be some sculpting detail here. If your character, if you have experience using any of the sculpting stuff in Blender, this is on the table for you. If you do not, then we'll discuss it a little bit, but you know, there's not enough time to go into it in exhaustive detail. This is at the point where you could put in things like, you know, wrinkles and things like that. And if you do go through this sculpting detail step, it would be at this point that this would be, you would be baking the details into the normal map, and then remeshing. Then at this point, where we hopefully will be by the end of this week's assignment, we will then texture paint this object. Again, the level of detail here, some of you it may make sense depending on your style, right? Is it going to look, we'll call this medium to, you know, more realistic detail, making your game look photorealistic to the point that you know, God of War Ragnarok is, or something like that. Like that, there's going to be I think, outside of our achievability within our given amount of time. Yes? And so making things look stylistically realistic, but not saying that you're going to achieve some sort of incredibly convincing photorealism in the game, right? I would set your expectations below that, just in terms of like you're one person with this amount of time to take for this project. So, yes.
What size are we planning for the textures?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell everybody to certainly output them at 2048, but if you output them at 4096 for your character, chances are we're going to be fine. And because of, if you're going to Substance Painter, it's trivial to, step it down later if you find out that, your performance is just tanking. Most of the student projects in the past, they weren't, their poor performance, not grade-wise, but just frame rate-wise on the game is almost never a result of just like, oh, the textures were just too big on the character. It's like a variety of other issues that tank the performance. So, yeah, like if you want to texture at 4096 for the first go, that's probably fine. We're just trying to reach some sort of mid-high level performance on Windows here, right? Not some people may get a compromise thing, but the nice thing about Unity is that it's going to manage this in a relatively elegant way. In that it'll just this frame. Some people will get a less, just get a lower frame rate, but the game should still function for the most part, unless something is like really, really egregious, right? And then if you're getting a lower frame rate, then you can go on Discord and complain about it, which is like what Discord is for, right? Complaining about frame rates on video games. So, yeah. So texture paint, medium to realistic. This is going to go to Substance Painter. And so our last step in here is UV unwrapping. And because this isn't 185, if you already have skill here, you should do this on your own. If you don't, I'm going to show you a bunch of techniques here to get usable UV unwraps, because you need to have that part step done in order to texture paint, right? And so this character workflow is pretty, you have to step down this workflow pretty sequentially. There's not a lot of, if you go back, you need to go through the steps again. It's not like, there's not many of these steps where you could go back, make a change, and then skip back up to this part. If you go back to make a change, you're going to need to go through the things. The good news is, doing every time you do that is just straight up practice, right? So it's just simpler to go through this process. If you're not having something, if you're having something that looks more toonish, or we'll say solid color, in that the or simpler shading, right? Part of what you want to be putting in your game design document is visual references in terms of like, what does this game actually look like, right? Does it look more like God of War Ragnarok, or does it look more like Untitled Goose Game, right? Because that, again, even though they're both games, they require totally different workflows, right? Again, the thing that separates this from painting. Painting is incredibly complex. You don't want to oversimplify it here, but on some level, it's a canvas and you're putting paint on the canvas. It's a lot of techniques there, but it's not like the canvas. In our case, the paint itself is like a totally different technical implementation, right? Versus like painting directly in Substance Painter versus having a shader that you're changing, right? We've already experienced this a little bit in Unity, right? Where there's the shaders that sort of did the solid colors versus the shaders that did more realistic shading. There's an entirely infinite shade or continuum of changes along that idea, all of which require changes to the shader code to some extent. So those are all different. And so at this point, you would need to make some decisions as in terms of the style, which you should be confronting as you're putting your game design document together as far as what it looks like. Because then this for the shading of the whole game, this is where people will be branching off a lot in terms of like how I'm achieving the look and feel of the actual visual assets of the game. Yeah. And then sort of at the same time as this one, there's some decisions to be made about the, let's call it face complexity. We're going to want everyone to have eyes, but there'll be two sort of main categories here, is that is this represented in a mesh, or is it represented in the texture? So for instance, Astrobot has a very expressive face that is all done in the texture that is overlaid on this part of the bot, right? The other famous bots that do this kind of thing, like Eve in Wall-E, right? As opposed to her eyes are there we go. Who is this woman? Her incredibly expressive eyes are the result of animating a texture that is on this part of the mesh. Yes.
Are we gonna go over how to animate textures?
Yeah. As opposed to Wall-E, whose eyes are actually, for the most part, like mesh components there, right? Like one of the most expressive things about Wall-E, I mean, he does have like eyebrows-ish. Yeah, he has like those little flaps, right? And so there, and then his eyes also have like an aperture thing that opens and closes as part of his animation. And so like completely different technical strategies for achieving expressive faces, right? And then also, I would really, I think, you know, again, almost everybody's seen Wall-E. If you haven't seen Wall-E, like that should actually go before Everything Everywhere All at Once on your list. For a variety of reasons, like watching Wall-E after Everything Everywhere All at Once would seem to be a strange experience. But I constantly reference the first act of Wall-E in terms of the fact that it's not only great, but there's a lot of achievable artistic strategies I think you should learn from the first act of Wall-E. No one talks in the first act of Wall-E, right? You hear a handful of like voiceover things and tapes he plays and things like that. But Wall-E and Eve barely talk in the first act, right? Before the fat people show up. I mean, the whole movie's good, but the first act is really a masterpiece. And then neither Wall-E nor Eve have mouths, right, in their design. And so, like, that's also an important thing to learn there, right? In terms of, again, like a artistic constraint, like my characters won't have mouths, but like how do you solve that problem creatively? In this case, the result is without, I think, pretty much without argument better, right? Like, would the first act of Wall-E be better if Eve and Wall-E have mouths in their design? Like, my personal opinion is absolutely not, right? And so what on the surface level seems like some sort of constraint is really much more powerful. And then again, the other lesson to take away is like how much emotion can be portrayed just in the eyes or eye, right? Even just one eye there, right? Just that one point of focus. Really great. So, yeah, really, you know, both a lot of, to do a version of sort of Wall-E's bot design is not crazy, especially once we look at a little bit of Substance Painter here. A lot of the detail are things that would be paintable into the texture. Now, while the main exception being the tank tread, which is a complex thing that would I would discourage tread-based locomotion, in that does present a lot of issues there. Maybe there's a handful of things we could do, but something you would need to go into it knowing that you've committed to a lifestyle change during the time that you're going to try and make this character tread happen, right? So it would be that level of like how much do you want it personally, right? There. It's a decision only you can make, right? Like, what are you willing to sacrifice for the treads on this video game character? Then after this, we need to then rig the character. And so at this point, we'll look at a few options. We'll obviously look at Mixamo, which is a great way to expedite a lot of stuff for rigging just humanoid bipeds. For non-humanoid bipeds, we have Rigify in Blender. And our basic process here is that we need to have our bones, which in Blender is constantly referred to as our armature. And then these need to get weighted to the mesh. And so there, this is a process which we want to, as much as possible, be done procedurally. Because certainly, as I've taught this over and over and over again, this is like, I'll go ahead and do this and put that in red. This is a alert. There's been many a student who's been sidetracked here by the weight painting. You'll find hundreds, thousands of overly simplified weight painting tutorials on YouTube that present it as a thing that's like, yeah, you just you're good, and it's both things. It's a complex thing, and the tools tend to fall short in many regards, and so it can definitely be a pain point here. And so setting yourself up to have a good result with the procedural weight painting tools has to do with a lot with the modeling decisions here, and posing decisions for the character. Again, if the arms and appendages are discreetly and clearly laid out, then the automatic algorithms do a much better job out of the box here, versus your arm is like this, then it gets smushed into the body, and then like the amount of time between this being done well up until now or poorly could result in like a 10 to 20x amount of time dumped into this part of the process to try and compensate for poor decisions that were made earlier, right? So just an alert there. This is up until now, shaping the character, texture painting the character. It's hard to make decisions that you'll end up paying for a lot later on. It's possible, but like I don't see people do it as often. But when we get to the rigging and the weight painting, which is it's just complicated, right? Like there is a real effort to make it more user-friendly, right? Because again, this isn't a class about becoming professional character riggers. That's a different curriculum, right? We're just trying to use characters here and become familiar with the process to the point where you understand it, you've gone through it, you understand it, and you understand it to the point that you could participate in a larger workflow in which characters are being rigged, right? And so we're going to try to leverage the tools to make things easier where possible. And then once we're here, once we're rigged and the armature is set up, then we are in the world of animating. And so our character, there'll be some deviation here, but we're going to need to have some kind of idle slash, standing around. Animation, some sort of movement. So this can take the form of a walk and or run. And then most of you will have some sort of jump. The jump is a little more complex. Start, air, land. And then from this point, things could be differentiated. There could be an attack. There could be a dodge. And the other difference at this part is that each of these animations needs to be designed with the consideration that this is going into a game and it'll be triggered in a non-linear fashion. So a lot of you have done walk cycles, and 90% of what you've learned there is applicable here. But then there's a few things about how things get managed, in that all of this then comes back into Unity. And then you have your character mesh, and then we use the animator, like we have for the button and the bouncing ball, to manage the animation state machine, which essentially in Unity here at that point, is the big level here is that when the character is, not moving, or another word for that is still, then we are playing the idle animation. And when we start to move, we play walk, or even move faster, we go to run. And then when we press the jump button, just like we triggered the jump sound effect previously, we trigger the jump animation, and attack and dodge, similar kind of things. Not doge. Dodge from the button press.
So on those animations, we're gonna do that in Blender and then like make them better in Unity, or this is all that's gonna be done in Unity?
No, the animating here, Blender.
Okay.
And then in Unity, essentially, we're sequencing the animations. Right. Most of the work there is in just getting the animator set up, which should look fairly similar for everybody, you know, along the lines of this level of complexity, right? So before we had a very simple thing where it's just sort of like back and forth, right? And now we'll have a slightly more complex thing, you know, really trying to avoid this kind of situation over here for our level of character complexity there.
That's what we're turning in.
You have to have that by the class.
Does laying this out like this help in terms of like understanding the map of where we're going here? And if you know, like we're going to St. Louis, you don't know how to get to each individual city yet, right? There's some decisions in Amarillo you're going to need to make that we haven't really talked about yet, but we know where we're pointed at this point. If you get to a point where you have to make some decisions in Amarillo, Texas, like take some time to really make the right ones there. You guys been to Amarillo? Anyone from Amarillo before I crash the place? Okay. Usually not, right? Just statistically, it's unlikely.
I don't think those people ever leave that much.
You said it, I didn't.
Our pots are so cute.
Yeah, I mean, the consistent cuteness of Pokemon design is notable, even if it's not like, I'm not super personally interested in.
Talking about the flower pots, like the actual physical.
Oh yeah, those are cool too, yeah.
These guys are ugly. Yeah, these aren't cute.
No.
Right, so like I made that joke before, like maybe a blob as a character is not a good decision, but like it would totally depend on what the blob looks like. Like this, whatever's happening here, right? Like it's kind of an abstract character design, but something like this would be not super daunting to take advantage of, and sort of like very basic bipedal kind of things, right? And so many of the Pokemon designs, floaty-ish characters that still have like stub arms and stub legs, right? In that this gives you the opportunity for expression, but you know, like we're not we're not galloping on these stub arms. Yes, Adrian.
A blobby character you could think of is Ditto, since he doesn't have much to work with.
Yeah, that's actually know that one. That's one of my son's favorite characters, right? Yeah, but he morphs into other shapes. Morphing would be on the list of things I would not include in my character design, right? Yeah, I'm going to make an omnipotent blob that can look like anything else in the game. There's a lot to do there, right? Versus like I'm going to make a blob that just continues to look like a blob throughout the entire game, right? Again, another lesson in anthropomorphization, just 2 dots and a line immediately turn this into a character rather than like a stain on the floor, right? So like just really, if something has eyes, we immediately give it that weight. Okay. So let's look at, where are we at here? Okay, quickly, some ideas about blocking out here in Blender, and we'll go into more detail on this on Wednesday, right? And so as you're, I mean, I'm sure all of the homework for tomorrow is pretty much done at this point, and, you know, so maybe these are slight changes you could make for those of you who haven't totally completed tomorrow's homework yet.
5%
Yeah, right. I'm putting a lot of like sarcasm on that, right? But as you're working on, you're just encouraging my bad personality traits. You're just turning them up. As you're doing this, right? Now that we've talked about this more in detail, the visual style of the game, right? I hope I made the point that it may make significant changes to your workflow, right? And so being able to, in your design document, commit more to a specific visual style helps us all come to a better plan for what is the workflow going to be to achieve said visual style. So the visual style of the whole game and the visual style of the protagonist. Obviously, one of the most important things in the game that we'll see throughout the entire course of the game. Okay, so think about that as you're putting your finishing touches on things for tomorrow. A couple things about putting things together here in Blender. So just primitive block out, 2 options here, cube or cylinder. Smoothing out a cube always results in something that's cubish, right? So if you want your character to be more organic, using a cylinder as a basic block out component may be more successful. However, by default, the cylinder has 32 radial subdivisions. This is way too many for blocking out. And so I would step on that down to like 6, right? And you're like, that doesn't even look like a cylinder anymore. You would be correct. But again, like I said, you would be able to smooth this out later. So for instance, here, this is something, for instance, basic, typical bipedal appendages. This would be a good starting point for our blockout shapes, okay? Because we're able to smooth said thing out there. With the cube itself, adding subdivision where needed, a couple modeling tools to keep in mind here, tab in and Control R is the loop cut tool that allows us to precisely add more subdivision where needed. And if you're doing this with a primitive, right after having made it, it'll pretty much work out of the box because the primitives are set up in a way that you should be able to cut around them. You haven't done a bunch of things to disturb their simple topology at this point, and so the loop cut tool will work. The loop cut tool will not work in perpetuity throughout the process unless you've managed the topology in a certain way. So know that, okay? Because there is some intelligence here. It is finding a loop around the object in terms of the topology, and if the topology has not been managed in a very specific way as it gets more complex, then it won't do that, okay? But here, the other thing about the loop cut tool in Blender is like you press Control R, then you sort of mouse over, then you click. You still have not cut. You have just committed to the first step of the cutting process, the plane along which you want to cut. Then you get to slide it along the topology, and then you can cut. Now I have added topology to this. It's there. So if I want to make this block out here a little bit fatter, I can select this top one and scale that down. Remember, I'm in edit mode, thank you. So this is not affecting our control scale there. And so there we have that. If I grab this and then tab, scale, maybe scale it this way. Again, I'm in edit mode right now. And so I'm just sort of looking at some of these options. Like, okay, maybe it's fat belly here. And so let's come back up to here. Tab, grab this one. And so here, right, I want more stuff down here. The loop cut cuts in the existing shape. The extrude, which we used a little bit here, E and down, brings it down. S scales it in, right? So that gives me more of like a waist-ish area there. Tab back up. Grab this, move it over, up, like so. There we go. Let's rotate this a little bit. This is another thing. As you're sketching your character, let's write both of those down, actually. Up. T-pose for the arms and or other appendages, and then also bent knee, slight, is important. This is a decision you can make here that's gonna pay big dividends later on in the rigging process. If your character is totally like locked out straight legs, the default movement of the bones may not be correctly assumed, and then that requires a lot of extra work to make sure the knees don't bend backwards, right? Now, if you have a bird-like character, right, the knees do go the opposite way, or if they're actually the ankles, however that works out in bird anatomy, I don't know. Anyways, it goes back here, right? And so if that is the case, you would want the slight bend in the other direction, right? Or if it's going to be like some sort of mech, a little bit different. Okay, and so there, and over here. Shift D gives me a second one of these. Right? Doing more things in orthographic views here makes the precise positioning a little bit easier. So Shift D, now I can bring this in, and now if I just jam R, I know that I'm rotating on this, and then if I tab in, I can grab different parts of it. Again, come back here. The orthographic views are your friends. S, scale that down, right? Here, I want a fat thigh, tab out, grab this one, tab in, Control R, grab here, click again, S, bring this up a little bit there, okay? This kind of gap can be problematic, whereas this kind of thing gets smoothed out pretty easily. And so extending this just a touch further will certainly give you a little bit more dividends in the next part of the process here. Notice that extending this straight in this direction becomes weird because this is oriented in global space. But just by switching, this does nothing to change the model, just switches the gizmo. There, now I can pull this straight down in that direction, right? So managing this menu between global and local becomes very, very, very critical there in terms of like just working a little bit more efficiently. Let's save this because I'm not an idiot. Let's do that. Save as. There we go. And down here, Shift A, cube. I'm gonna bring this strip up, tab, and you can go into edit mode with multiple objects. Oh, okay, I messed up there. There we go. We discussed this before, but just to review, you can add new objects in edit mode, right? If I Shift A and add something here, like this cube, it is now, this cube and cylinder are in the same object here. This is undesirable for our use case in character blockout. Even though these are going to get summed together into a single mesh at some point later, like having them be individual objects at this point makes it easier to manipulate the shape. And so don't do that. Make sure when you add a new object, you've tabbed it back out to object mode, then you shift A. You can also tell because if you shift A in edit mode, this list will be much shorter because it doesn't let you add cameras and lights and stuff to a mesh object. That doesn't make any sense. And so, yeah, here we go. Cube, tab, scale. Look at it over here. This, like this, like this. Again, if you're not seeing the gizmos, I have them on pretty much all the time because I've checked these boxes here, right? As a way to, if you don't have all of the Blender shortcuts memorized already, then the gizmo allows you to, use the program, which is great. And so bring this down. And more or less. Again, trying to keep all the topology as simple as possible right now for my blockout stuff. And let's just save that as is for now, but you can see how I'm getting, close to blocking something out. Not a lot of time here. I would definitely start by doing 1/2 of the character because things can be mirrored later. We need to join them before they can be mirrored as one mesh, right? And so the joining is Control J, and joining takes multiple meshes and puts them into one mesh object, right? So if I just grab them all here like this, trying to be careful not to grab the lights and camera. In fact, you could just delete the lights and camera because we don't care about those at all in this class because we're just making 3D shapes in Blender. All our light and camera decisions are over in Unity, right? And in fact, you're helping yourself because I'm sure, as some of you are experienced, if you import a mesh that has its own camera over in Unity, it screws up the entire Unity camera system unless you've deleted it. So you're just saving yourself some trouble there. So now, right, all of this could be joined, Control J. Now you see it's a single mesh object, but join does not change the topology. This is something clear to understand here at the beginning, is that none of the vertices have been fused together here. They just are simply exist as their own thing. In fact, you could even still access them to some extent in edit mode. If you come in and grab a single part of that individual part, if you Control L, it selects the linked faces, right? So what is actually connected here? Now, it eventually will take it further here and fuse these things together to some extent, but Control L, if you need to make a change to like this particular thing, I want a fatter thigh, right? I can do that by Control L and grabbing this individual part here. And so now, just as a workflow idea, right here is the mirror. And so the mirror, if we come back here, the mirror, the important things to write down about the mirror, modifiers that's completely dependent on your anchor point for the object. And so let's come back, let's turn it off and manage that first. Because when you join them, that can be kind of an arbitrary process. And then at that time, it's probably a good idea to manage the anchor point. And so we come back in here to our tools and then origin, and we go into orthographic view here so that we can precisely paste the origin point. And so hit G and move this down here. Most of the time you're going to want this to be here, bottom, middle. There we go. For some reason, mine also got strangely rotated. Just adjusting that, you probably won't have that issue. Right, now that's there. Now if I turn the mirror modifier back on, okay, that's somewhat more sensible results, but I'm mirroring on the wrong axis. Which axis do I want to mirror on? Yeah, exactly. And so if I get rid of X and turn on Y, you see what the mirror modifier does here. Thighs too thick, right? Here, either here, we could do it a bunch of different ways, but one of the ways would be Control L, Shift, Control L, Shift, Control L. Now I have the whole foot there, and so I could do this to create some more space there, and then also in the character design, right, like how important it is to my narrative that the character have not skipped leg day, right? There we go. And so that's a little bit better. And then the other powerful thing in mirror is that it will also bisect, although you may need to flip, right? And so bisect is like, do I, in addition to flip mirroring, do I cut down the middle so that I don't, so that the stuff, right, that sticks over, in this case, this stuff, right, is on the other side. Most of the time you do want to cut that off. You may or may not have to press flip depending on what direction which half of the character you made there. I guess it makes more sense if you don't want to, if you want to click less buttons to do the character's left side first. It's a fairly arbitrary decision. Right, and now from here we can take steps forward. The other thing I want to just very quickly say here is like bringing in your reference image. And so let's look at that real quick. Okay, on one level, just dragging an actual JPEG in here. Just dragging the image in gives us a usable reference here, right? However, there's some issues. We want it to be properly represented, so Alt-G sort of zeroes out the location, Alt-R zeroes out the rotation, and so then you could manage this. Remember, Control or just coming over here and manually dialing in your rotation values would allow you to get this in here. And this works to some, this is fine. This is the most direct drive way to do it. If you would have one side and one front view, you could then, Shift D this and then rotate it in order to create that. I'm just doing it quickly. And so then your alignment, right? But this sort of 3/4, putting this in the middle there allows for that to happen. Does it make sense there, right? So level 1 of putting just any image in as a reference. If we were to be a little bit more particular, if we come over here, if we're back out to object mode, and we were to bring in an image as reference specifically. It brings it in with a few other options, right? So Alt G. And Alt R. And then here, there's a couple things. You can choose to have it only in orthographic or perspective, which I think is pretty useful. And so, for instance, because the views that you're going to use to sketch your model are orthographic, if you say only show it in orthographic on this, we should only show in orthographic. There we go. And so now when I'm here, I'm not seeing it, but if I go into any of the orthographic modes by using the numbers, then it shows up. But then when I come back here, when I'm just sort of orbiting around doing my work, it's not there. And so I think that's useful. That's enough reason to bring it in the more complex way, specifically as a reference image. And then you can also dial in the opacity of it in a way that allows you to sort of see through. And it also helps here when you can make this see through, and right, so it allows you a little more flexibility in lining up different parts of the object for your block out. Okay, very beginnings of the block out. Wednesday, I look forward to seeing everyone's game analysis and game design document pitches. I linked to many different examples of game design documents. The primary lesson to learn from that is there a standard format for game design documents? No. In fact, it's one of the least standardized classifications of document I can think of, right? Look at the ones, all of them. Think about what you want to make, how it relates to those different games as much as you're familiar with them. And then ask yourself, does this game design document, do you think it was a useful thing for the people who made this game, right? That's the whole point of going into the game design document. It's not just to do extra work. It's hopefully to save you work later on, right? That you're going to come up with a game design document that is useful for you later, which is why I linked specifically to the one-page game design document talk from GDC, which if you haven't watched already, you should definitely watch in its entirety. It's a really, really good talk. GDC, the talks online, is an amazing resource for game design information that doesn't really get surfaced a lot in my YouTube feed for some reason. You know, I have to specifically, I have that bookmarked, all of that stuff there, because it's really, really great information. Sometimes it's just parts of things that are very in particular, but that talk in particular about making a one-page thing. Wait, one page, not meaning that like it all fits on a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper, just meaning that it's in one continuous visual space, which I think is super valuable. There's too much information that is visually siloed online, right? One of the most important examples being YouTube tutorials, right? Where there's so much information out there that's sort of buried in these longer videos that's very, very, very hard to access, right? Maybe sometimes it's chapterized, but being able to access that in a more direct way is something I'm trying to do with our stuff and everything else in general. Okay, great. All right, awesome. Everybody feel like they're achieving a higher level of clarity about what's going on with this?
Yes, I feel ready to start the project now.
Let me continue.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
By start, I mean continue the substantial amount of work I've already done on this project. Right. Okay, great. I really look forward to seeing everybody's ideas on Wednesday. You know, be flexible. And this is also another opportunity to expand your ability or capacity for the unknown, right? We've gone through the process in a small way before. This is going to be a larger one, a self-directed one, and I look forward to helping everyone along the process. But our processes, our paths will diverge, and so we'll try to all support each other down those divergent paths. All right, that's it. We're done. Bye.